So last time we talked about food production, food instability, famine, and malnutrition. We also discussed soils and how we use and abuse them. And then we got into sustainable farming practices, and then finally consumer practices and steps that we can take to push for sustainable farming practices. Today, we're going to discuss environmental health and toxicology. So, first of all, what is health? Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being. It is not merely the absence of a disease. And disease is a change in the body's condition that impairs important physical or psychological functions. Now, when we're talking about morbidity, that is a synonym for illness. And a synonym for death is mortality. So, in the news, when we're talking about comorbidities for COVID patients, for example, we're talking about illnesses that that patient has at the same time. And so, of course, the environmental health then will focus on factors that cause disease, including elements of the natural, social, cultural, and technological world. There are major sources of environmental health risks around us all of the time. Many of them are very interconnected with each other and feed off of each other, sort of like different pieces in a puzzle. So, together, lead, chemicals, and smoking, these are all considered toxins. Those toxins then can also feed into different sources of pollution. They could be made worse through pollution in our air and in our water. And then couple that with different traumas that make people differently susceptible to pollution and toxins. And then finally, also susceptible to biological agents like protozoa, bacteria, and viruses. So all of this is happening in concert with each other. Global disease burden is actually changing. It's changing right now and gaining more and more attention, and we're trying to find different ways to calculate that disease burden. We used to calculate causes of death, and now we've shifted more to calculating what is called the disability adjusted life years, or DALYs, as a measure of disease burden instead of simply causes of death. The world now is undergoing a dramatic epidemiological transition, and that's because much of the world, of course, is highly interconnected, and we are continuously, as a human population, removing the barriers between human populations and wildlife. We are seeing rises in chronic conditions, including cardiovascular disease and cancer. And these things are no longer afflicting only wealthy people. It's also occurring in those lower socioeconomic status people. We're also seeing the rise in traditional illnesses, including infections and complications associated with birth. We also, as discussed in our last lecture, are experiencing differentially across the globe malnutrition and nutritional differences that can also cause extensive death in communities. And so here is a table that is expressing the leading causes of global disease burden on Earth. This is including emergent and infectious diseases that are killing millions of people. Many of these are considered communicable diseases. These are things that are passed between different people, and they're still responsible for about 1/3 of all disease-related mortality. This is even in spite of the great advent of antibiotics, modern medicine, waste removal services, and sanitation practices. We are still killing millions of people through communicable diseases. Life expectancy, this just happened in the United States, was said to be reduced by an entire year in the United States because of a particular communicable disease, COVID-19. We can take a look at the top 5 leading causes of global disease burden on Earth. In 1990, pneumonia led the list, followed by diarrhea, perinatal conditions, depression, and then heart disease. Compare that to 2020, you see heart disease has risen from position 5 all the way to 1, and depression shot up to number 2, followed by traffic accidents, stroke, and then chronic lung disease. So again, these communicable diseases are extremely important and are timely and top of mind right now as we live in this global pandemic of the novel coronavirus. So in addition to the novel coronavirus, we also have these other communicable diseases, including diarrhea, acute respiratory illnesses, malaria, measles, tetanus, and other infectious diseases. In the United States, we are extremely fortunate to have strong vaccinations against many of these, but still around the world, these communicable diseases kill about 11 million children every year in developing countries. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. We are seeing in these communities the delivery of better nutrition, clean water, and apparatuses to clean the water in their communities, improve sanitation practices, and inexpensive inoculations that can eliminate most of the deaths that we're talking about. So there is hope on the horizon. So communicable diseases are mainly transmitted through pathogens that are disease causing. So pathogens are any type of microscopic organism or virus that causes disease in humans or wildlife. Here we have examples at the top, for example, influenza virus here. It is not considered living because it is a virus, although there is great debate about what makes life life, but we won't go there. This is influenza. You also have pathogenic bacteria pictured here, and then a Giardia microscopic organism here that's responsible for the disease Giardia. So we have a couple of pathogens that afflict humans, including viruses, bacteria, protozoans, and parasites, including flukes and tapeworms. The greatest loss of life from an individual disease in a single year was called the quote unquote Spanish flu, but it was the Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918. That was about 100 years ago now, and many use the example of the Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918 as a model for how we're dealing with the novel coronavirus right now. But during that time, nearly 100 million people across the globe died. So talking about outbreaks of different infectious diseases, let's touch on malaria. Malaria is one of the most prevalent remaining infectious diseases on Earth today. There are about 500 million new cases each and every year. And every year, 1 million people die from it annually, mostly on the African continent. In addition to malaria, there are also these things called emergent diseases. We call them emergent because they're not previously known or have been nearly entirely absent for the last 20 years. And an example of the types of emergent diseases that we're talking about is the novel coronavirus. And here in just the last year, the novel coronavirus has now killed nearly 500,000 Americans. Over 400,000 Americans have died because of the novel coronavirus or complications with the comorbidities that those coronavirus patients had. There have been at least 40 outbreaks of emergent diseases over the past 2 decades. This includes Ebola and HIV, AIDS, and SARS. We can take a look at the distribution of these different outbreaks, and some of them were highly lethal infectious diseases. Some of them were not as bad, but you could see through time that every corner of the globe has been impacted by some sort of infectious disease. Here in Kansas, for example, in 2014, there was this bourbon virus. There was an outbreak of measles in California in 2014. The list goes on and on. So the question really is, why are super contagious organisms emerging in so many different places across the globe? One of the largest answers to this question has to do with the barriers that humans are continuously tearing down between human populations and wildlife. And I'm going to show this video that explains why that is so scary.
We know that the novel coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic has brought our planet to a complete halt. Trade and commerce, travel and tourism, Even doing mundane things like going to a supermarket or eating out or going to the movies, everything has been suspended. Every time one thinks about this pandemic, one cannot help thinking about the wet markets in Wuhan, China, suspected as the origin of the disease. Was it an infected bat that transferred the disease to someone like a shopkeeper or a customer? Or did an infected bat transmit this disease first to a pangolin from where it jumped to humans? We may not be absolutely certain about the origin of COVID 19, but what we know for a fact is that most human disease causing pathogens came from animals. And when I say most, I mean over 60% of them. This transference of a disease from an animal to human beings is called zoonosis, and all such diseases collectively are called zoonotic diseases. All recent epidemics have their origin in animals. For example, the extremely fatal Ebola virus, which has killed 11,323 people between 2014 and 2016 in West Africa, was transmitted either from bats or non-human primates. The severe acute respiratory syndrome or the SARS epidemic of 2002-3 was caused by civet cats, and the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome or MERS came from camels. Even the root of influenza or the common flu can be found in birds and pigs, and HIV came from monkeys. The list goes on and on. Yet, zoonotic diseases differ in the way they are transmitted. Dog owners are conscious that their pets need vaccination against rabies. Rabies is spread among humans through a bite of an infected dog. This is called direct transmission. Similarly, influenza, which can be transmitted through air, or SARS, which may have been acquired by meat handlers directly from animals, are examples of direct transmission. Direct transmission is when a human acquires an animal disease straight from the infected animal. In contrast, diseases can also be delivered to humans through an intermediary or a vector. Here, the vector, like a mosquito, is just transporting the pathogen. But the mosquito does not get infected. Instead, it transfers it to a human. The Zika fever is one such example where mosquitoes may have first introduced the virus to humans from monkeys. Or the African sleeping sickness, the microbe of which is transported by the tsetse fly from wild and domesticated animals to infect humans. With COVID 19, the world is again rattled by a strike from a zoonotic disease. And yet, there is very little introspection about why these diseases are so rampant. The only reason for such outbreaks is human activity. Deforestation has led to serious outbreaks of diseases like Ebola, Zika, Nipah, and many others. Ebola is a classic case where scientists suspect that a 2-year-old child playing under bat-infested trees was the trigger for the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Similarly, Lyme disease, which infects 30,000 people in the US, has become a major problem because of dwindling population of animals like opossums and chipmunks, which control the population of ticks, the main carrier of the disease. Bad sanitation policies have led to an increase in vector-borne zoonotic diseases like dengue and chikungunya. Then, there is the practice of eating wild animals, some of which are consumed raw. COVID 19 and SARS are the two best examples of viruses spreading through this route. And then we have commercial farming of animals, which has made people more susceptible to diseases like bird flu and swine flu. Overexposure of antibiotics on farm animals has increased antibiotic resistance in disease-causing microbes, creating a silent pandemic across the world. WHO estimates that 700,000 people die every year because of antimicrobial resistance. This includes multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, which was once a disease of zoonotic nature. COVID 19 is only one of the 200 zoonotic diseases we know of. Many more will emerge because of the severe degradation that we have done to the planet's natural environment. Since the beginning of the 20th century, more people have died due to such diseases than any of the wars, including the world wars. Even as the world prays for a COVID 19 breakthrough, the next microbe aiming to conquer the world is waiting around the corner.
All right. So in that video, he discussed the idea of zoonotic diseases and zoonosis. So to bolster the background for you of zoonoses, I've also supplied you a reading in the week 6 folder on the tartan. So let's talk about the facts and figures of coronavirus. The novel coronavirus is part of a large family of viruses that in the past have caused outbreaks, including SARS that was discussed in the video that we just watched. We call it novel because it is new. It is a new version of this SARS virus. Again, coronavirus is zoonotic, which means it can be spread between animals and people. Signs of infection include fever, cough, shortness of breath, and breathing difficulties. It can also manifest in a number of different ways, just depending upon the comorbidities that the patient has. The transmission of the coronavirus can be prevented with basic precautions, including hand washing, using hand sanitizer, proper hygiene, covering your mouth when you're coughing, wearing a mask, and socially distancing. And the number of infections worldwide is likely underreported. We're learning about specific cases more and more every day. And some people are more vulnerable. That includes elderly people, people over 65, those with pre-existing conditions, and people who are chronically exposed to pollutions due to socioeconomic conditions. So that would be Black and Indigenous people of color. So humans aren't the only ones to suffer from new and devastating diseases. For example, wildlife and domestic animals also experience sudden and widespread epidemics, which are sometimes called ecological diseases. We're coming to recognize now that the delicate ecological balance that we value so highly and unfortunately disrupt so frequently are important to our own health. Poor wildlife health generally equates to poor human health due to the interconnectedness of nature and the human population. So, one way to approach that problem is through conservation medicine. Conservation medicine is actually an emerging discipline that attempts to understand how our environmental changes threaten our own health as well as that of the natural communities that surround us. So, in conservation medicine, there is an attempt to understand how environmental changes that we impart on the environment are actually impacting our own health and the health of those ecological communities and the services that those communities provide. So in that video that we took a look at, they also mentioned the rise of antibiotic resistant bacteria. So we've probably all heard of Staphylococcus before. It's commonly called staph, and it's actually extremely common. Most people have at least some staph bacteria. They are the common cause of sore throats and skin infections, but they're usually easily diagnosed and controlled. There is a new strain, though. It's called the MRSA strain. It gets its name because it is resistant to methicillin antibiotics. So we call it MRSA. It can be found in a whole lot of different areas, including academic settings like gym locker rooms or contact sports. These are usually sources of infection of MRSA. Several states have actually had to close their schools as a result of outbreaks of MRSA. And in 2006, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that at least 100,000 MRSA infections in the United States resulted in about 19,000 deaths. So, how does antibiotic resistance occur? you can have two ways by which this antibiotic resistance is conferred. Number one has to do with natural selection and evolution of those different strains of bacteria. So the idea is natural selection and the ability of many organisms to evolve rapidly. We have that depicted here on the top of this figure. And this is depicting mutation and selection that is creating drug-resistant strains of a single bacterium. So here, all of this is a bacterial colony of Staphylococcus aureus. When you inflict an antibiotic on this entire bacterial colony, most of the bacterial colony actually dies. You'll notice, though, that this particular cell of Staphylococcus aureus has a specific mutation, and that mutation just so happens to confer resistance of that antibiotic to the bacterium, which means even though all of these other cells of Staphylococcus aureus have been killed, this one remains. So then what happens? There's going to be an evolution of an entirely resistant colony through the propagation of that mutation that was beneficial for that organism and allowed it to survive. That way, whenever that same antibiotic is reintroduced to that resistant colony, the antibiotic is going to be completely useless against that resistant colony. Another way to confer this resistance is the human tendency to use these control measures, including antibiotics, carelessly and indiscriminately. So what we do here is we have a harmful bacterium that is alongside a bacterium that has harmless drug resistance within it. Okay, so this harmful bacterium, it is able to acquire a mutation from this harmless bacterium through a process called conjugation. Okay, so now this green harmful bacterium contains a piece of DNA that allows it to be drug resistant. And so upon replication, we now have an entire resistant colony of that harmful bacterium, which means once you try to apply antibiotics to that bacterium and the entire colony, it's going to be resistant and not effective at all. So this is, again, a strong case against the overuse of antibiotics in the products that we use every day, including industrialized farming practices that overuse antibiotics all of the time.